Okay, recording has started, so we will go ahead and get started this morning. Hi, everyone. I am Caitlin Huckabee, the Director of Supplier Maintenance, and welcome to the second ACP training workshop. I am so excited that you have joined us this morning. Today's topic is the W-9 form. I know that is everyone's most favorite topic. Just kidding. It's more like everyone's major pain point. But after today, I am confident that everyone will have a much better understanding of the form. Before we get started, we do have 2 more trainings planned, one in March, one in June. We do not have the dates set in stone for those trainings yet, nor the topics. So if you have any great topic ideas for us, please send us an email at our supplier maintenance email address and include in the subject ATW. And also, so we have started these trainings for you all. We had agencies ask us for training, so please get involved with us and provide us with any feedback that you have and anything that you want us to cover in these trainings. Let me make sure everyone's muted. And Ryan, go ahead and share those slides. Sorry, I didn't prompt. I'm going to mute everybody. Okay, I hope everyone can see Ryan's screen. And then go to the next slide, Ryan. Perfect. Okay. So like I said, we created these trainings for you. So please, please, please provide us with any feedback that you have, any topic ideas, anything that you want us to cover during these trainings. Please, please provide it to us. We want these to be helpful and help us to make the whole supplier maintenance process a lot easier. So like I mentioned, today's topic is the W-9 form. This topic will be presented by Ryan Graves, and he is an accountant too in our section. After Ryan presents the W-9, we will have a Q&A session. So at that time, you can unmute yourself and ask us any questions. And also feel free to ask us questions in the chat box, and we will answer those at the end. So, all right, Brian, take it away.
All right, can you hear me? Yep, okay, cool. All right, thank you for that, Caitlin. Like Caitlin said, my name is Ryan Graves. I'm an accountant too here in supplier maintenance. I oversee the new supplier registrations, so the internal and external supplier registrations. As you all probably know, a lot of that is W-9 based. I do see a lot of familiar names in here, so if any of you have ever sent in questions about the ISR or ESR, chances are you've talked to me at some point. Like I mentioned, these are very W-9 heavy, so it is very possible that these questions were about the W-9 and just, getting the new suppliers registered. My goal for today is to help you all, the agencies, to be able to recognize both supplier maintenance's requirements for Form W-9, as well as some common errors. My hope is that after this training, you all will be able to recognize common errors on the W-9 when you first receive them. That way, as soon as you see that, you can go ahead and send that back to the supplier, let them know we will need a new W-9 in order for them to be processed, whatever requests they have. If you get a W-9, there is an error on it, you submit it to supplier maintenance, you wait 2-3 business days, get it returned back to you from supplier maintenance saying, this and this is wrong. Then you go back to the supplier, say, this is wrong. Can you please provide a new W-9? If we can just reduce that to only they send you the W-9 once, look at it, you notice the errors, send it back. That's going to reduce the turnaround time for all of these requests and really help out the entire supplier maintenance process. So I'm going to go over, what is the W-9? What are supplier maintenance's requirements? What are some common errors that we see? And really just try and streamline this whole W-9 process. So first of all, what is a W-9? It says right there at the top of the form, request for taxpayer identification number and certification. And that's exactly what this is. Basically, it's us requesting for the taxpayer's identification number in addition to their other information. And we need that for 1099 reporting so that we can report all payments made to these suppliers. Just real quick, supplier, that means anyone who's getting paid by the state who's not a state employee. So people receiving 1099s. And just real quick overview of the Form W-9 here. One very important thing up top, I'm going to use this little laser pointer, so hopefully nobody's got any cats near the screen or anything like that. One thing that is required is line 1. This is going to be either your individual name or your business name. Line 1 cannot be left blank. Next up, line 2. I gave this one a green star. Line 2 is optional. The instructions here say business name or disregarded entity name if different from above. So line 2 is where you'll put a business name, disregarded entity, DBA, that's doing business as name. If it is different from line 1, line 2 is not required. Line 3 is required. This is the federal tax classification of the person or entity who is listed on line 1. Line 3 can only have one box selected. Can't have more than one federal tax classification. Moving further down the form, lines 5 and 6 are the address. We do need the W-9 to contain a complete address. This is called their 1099 address, the address on their W-9. It will be their primary address in Edison, address ID 1 on the supplier file. This is the address that we will send their 1099 to. And just to zoom in on that a little bit, line 5, it says address, number, street, apartment, suite number. Line 6, city, state, and zip code. All of these are required for the address. That does sound, sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised. We do get W-9s that don't list the state. They'll just say, Knoxville, Memphis, Nashville. We do get W-9s that do not list a zip code. It does have to have the zip code. One common error on line 5, the address does need to contain a complete address. So if the supplier's address is 102 Main Street and they just put 102 Main, we cannot accept that. We do need it to include that street suffix if USPS designates that there is a street suffix on that address. So we need to have the full address on lines 5 and 6. Right below line 6, line 7, it says list account numbers here, optional. Line 7 is optional. You don't have to put anything there. Sometimes suppliers will put their bank account numbers on there. We cannot add bank account numbers based on the W-9. If a supplier wants banking added to their supplier file, they will need to fill out a supplier direct deposit authorization form. So line 7 can be left blank. Next up is the tax ID number. That's going to be either a social security number or an EIN, employer identification number. It has to be one or the other. It cannot be both. And the tax ID number provided on the W-9 must match IRS records for the name provided on line 1 of the W-9. And I know that's been a problematic area, right? The tin match, but I will be getting a bit more into that. I'm going to go into a further explanation of tin match, hopefully clear up any misconceptions about that. So moving right along down to the bottom of the form, the signature of the person, all W-9s have to be signed. Supplier maintenance does request hand-signed W-9s. It has to be signed. And then last up is the date down there in the bottom right corner. W-9s received by supplier maintenance have to have been signed within 1 year of the date of submission. All right, so moving on, when is a W-9 needed from a supplier? When registering a new supplier, right? So if a supplier is not already registered for a supplier file in Edison, before we can approve them for a supplier file, we need a new W-9 from them, right? We need to get their tax identification number, their address, their business name, all their information. A W-9 is also needed when updating a supplier name in Edison or the supplier's DBA name. In Edison, each supplier file can only have one tax ID number associated with it, and each supplier file only has one tax ID number. There's one supplier file per tax ID number. So if your company is changing names but keeping the same tax ID number, you'll need to submit a new W-9 to the supplier maintenance email. We're going to do a TIN match on that new name just to make sure it matches IRS records before updating. And then once we've got the new W-9, we've confirmed the name change, that's when we'll go ahead and update the name in Edison. Updating a supplier's federal tax classification. In other words, their business type. That's what it's called in Edison on the supplier file. We get this information from line 3 of the W-9. If a supplier changes federal tax classifications, they will need to provide a new W-9 with the correct tax classification selected on line 3 and submit that to supplier maintenance in order to have their supplier file updated. A W, sorry. A W-9 is also needed when updating address 1 in Edison. Like I mentioned on that previous slide, address 1 in Edison, we call that the primary address. We call that the 1099 address. This address can only be changed by submitting a new W-9, right? You can add on a new remittance address, update remittance addresses without a W-9, but in order to update address 1 on a supplier file, we do need a W-9 with that new address listed on lines 5 and 6. And last up, to activate an inactive supplier file. This is one question we do get a lot. People will email into supplier maintenance saying, I'm trying to pay this supplier file. It's saying it's inactive. What needs to be done in order to activate the supplier file? Anytime a supplier file is in inactive status, we need a new W-9 to be submitted to the supplier maintenance email address. That's supplier.maintenance@tn.gov. Once we receive that new W-9, we'll use that information to update the supplier file and reactivate it. If a supplier file was inactivated due to a return warrant, so we tried to mail a 1099 to address 1 on a supplier file, USPS sent us that mail back saying this address is undeliverable, something like that, we would need a new W-9 that is dated more recently than the date of the return warrant, right? So if the return warrant happened December 1st, we would need a W-9 dated more recently than December 1st in order to reactivate that supplier file from the returned warrant. So that's a little bit about what the W-9 is, when it is needed. Now let's talk about where to find the W-9. Easiest place to find the W-9, irs.gov. Go straight to the source, right? They'll have the most updated version of the form, the revised October 2018 version. Also, if you can just Google IRS W-9, it's probably going to be the first one that pops up. We do also have the W-9 on our Division of Accounts Job Aids website. Now, this website, I would encourage everyone to go visit this website. I've got it saved to my favorites bar up at the top. I reference it all the time, especially for supplier maintenance. There's a ton of really good information on there for supplier maintenance, a ton of common questions answered in these things. It's a great resource if you're not sure what to do, how to update a supplier file, what documentation you need to get in order to process a certain request. Please check out that Division of Accounts Accounting Job Aids website. I've got a link to it right here, but I know probably can't copy something based off my PowerPoint. So if you want a little bit easier of a way to get to it, just go to tn.gov/finance. You'll then click on Division of Accounts, and then the link to the Accounting Job Aids website looks like this right here. Like I said, I've got this bookmarked to my very top of my web browser. I'm on there all the time. I just wanted to walk you all through a little bit of what is out there in the supplier maintenance section of this Accounting Job Aids website. So there's 3 sections here. We've got announcements, forms, and instructions. One announcement I did want to just highlight real quick: supplier maintenance emergency request procedures. So if you've got a request for supplier maintenance, either a new supplier registration, a request to update an existing supplier file, anything like that, and you need it processed today, you have to go locate this emergency request procedures form, and it will have some instructions for you to submit an emergency request to have your request expedited. A lot of the times, we'll get people emailing us, hey, can you please process this today? If you send that to any of the supplier maintenance staff, we're just going to send you back this supplier maintenance emergency request procedures. These must be followed in order to have a supplier maintenance request expedited. Moving down a little bit, forms, of course, right up top there, the one we're talking about today, current IRS W-9. This is a link to the current version of the form, the revised October 2018 version. If you ever need to locate the W-9, you can either go to IRS or this accounting job aids website. We've got the link right here. Also, some other really helpful links, not related to this presentation, but just supplier maintenance in general. The supplier maintenance supplier update form. We did just update this back in August, so there's a new version of the supplier update form that was covered in our previous training workshop. Right below that, we've got the supplier direct deposit authorization form. This form is required for any supplier to add banking information to their supplier file in order to set up direct deposit. They have to submit this supplier direct deposit authorization form. If you ever need to find that for a supplier, you can go here to the Accounting Job Aids website. And this next slide is just scrolling down a little bit on that list down to instructions. This is where there's going to be some really good information if you're ever not sure how to, submit a new supplier registration, if you're not sure what documentation you need to submit a certain request. Please check out these instructions. There are a ton of really good step-by-step instructions for these. For those who submit internal supplier registrations, right? We've got the agency submitter and approver manuals up here, do's and don'ts, workflow, that kind of thing. There is, in addition to my presentation here, if you would like more information on the W-9, we've got some supplier maintenance general IRS W-9 requirements. I know all of you are probably going to be rushing out there to learn more about the W-9 after this presentation, and I can't blame you. The next one up is one that I'm going to be talking about a lot here. This is called Supplier Maintenance IRS W-9 Summary Instruction Table. So this is kind of a flow chart that was put together by Supplier Maintenance. This is a very useful tool when trying to determine if a W-9 has been set up correctly. This is one that I've sent to both agencies and to suppliers themselves who are having trouble setting up a W-9. If you have ever been confused by a W-9, if you don't know how the W-9 works, if you frequently submit W-9s and have them returned to you, please go out to the Accounting Job Aids website, open up this W-9 summary instructional table and save this to your desktop. Just reference that anytime you have a W-9 question. I am going to be going a little bit more into that now, but before I do, just a couple more things on here. Address standards, that's going to give you a list of, what we need for an address that's entered either on the supplier update form or in a registration through the portal. So moving on, this is what I was just talking about, the IRS W-9 Summary Instruction Table. This is a flowchart that was created by Supplier Maintenance, and the way this works. So in the top left here, this says when one of the following federal tax classifications below is checked on line 3 of the IRS W-9. So this flowchart, we're kind of working backwards from line 3. You're going to see on line 3, which federal tax classification did this supplier select? If they selected, individual sole proprietors, single member LLC, then this is going to walk you through what every other line on the W-9 should look like for that federal tax classification, right? So if on line 3, they've got the box for C corporation selected, then this is going to say line 1, enter the entity's name as shown on the entity's tax return, right? Line 2, if you have a business name, trade name, DBA name, or disregarded entity name, parentheses, LLC, you may enter it on line 2, and, so on and so forth. Lines 5 and 6, enter your address, part 2 certification, have a handwritten signature, be dated within a year. So yeah, if you've got a supplier that's having some trouble filling out the W-9 in a way that we can accept, you can send them this chart. You can take a look at this chart yourself and trying to help them determine how it should be filled out. I will be coming back referencing this chart a little bit later in my presentation when I get a little bit more into the specific requirements of how a W-9 needs to be filled out according to the tax classification selected on line 3. But before we get into the specifics, I'm going to get into a little bit of general W-9 requirements. Just generally, right, the W-9 has to be legible. If we can't read the information on the W-9, we will need to send it back and have a new, more legible W-9 submitted. The W-9 cannot be altered in any way. So if it looks like, they had a different box checked on line 3, they whited that box out, drew a new little box over it, checked a different box, that we're going to have to send back. We're going to have to consider that to be an altered W-9. Same, on the address line. Maybe they started writing their address, they wrote it wrong, they scribble it out, right in the correct address right next to it. That also has to be considered an altered W-9. When we receive the form, it should not have been altered in any way. That's just to make sure, all the information on this form is coming from the person who filled out the form. That just leaves no possibility that anyone else got this W-9, whited it out, put their own information, anything like that. So if a W-9 looks like it has been altered at all, we will be sending that back and we will need a new unaltered W-9. The W-9 must be completed according to the IRS W-9 instructions. Those, we've got a couple on this slide. I'm going to get a bit more into those a little bit later. The W-9 has to be the most recent version of the form, the revised October 2018 version. And that's going to be shown in the top left corner of the W-9. It'll look just like this picture right here on my slide, where it says revised October 2018. If the supplier gets the W-9 from the IRS website, it should be, the most recent version of the form. If they get it from our accounting job aids website, or if you do, it will be the most recent version of the form. That's one thing to always just check and look in the very top left corner. It's a pretty common, error. The other day, I had one that was a 2002 version of Form W-9. That's a little bit more rare. Some common ones, 2017, 2014, 2011. All the time we're getting in those older W-9s. We do need to have the most up-to-date version of the form, which is that revised October 2018. If you open up a W-9, it looks a little bit different than what you're used to. Just go ahead and look up in that top left corner. It might be an outdated version. Supplier maintenance does request a hand-signed W-9. We are not able to accept electronic signatures. Does need to have the John Hancock down there at the bottom. Like I said previously, it does have to contain a complete address. If a supplier's address contains a street suffix, they will need to include that street suffix on line 5. That's, street, drive, boulevard, whatever. If USPS says that that's part of the address, it does need to be included on the W-9. Same with the zip code. It has to have a zip code, has to have a city, a state. The W-9 must have either an EIN or a social security number. It cannot have both. That's one thing that, when you receive a W-9 from a supplier, that's one thing that should be easy. If you spot it, it has both an EIN and a social security number. Go ahead and send that back to the supplier. As soon as you see that, they can start working on a new W-9. That's going to reduce the turnaround time for this request. The W-9 must be dated within 1 year of the date of submission. And that's not talking about the revised date over here, revised October 2018. What this is talking about is where it's signed down at the bottom of the form. We need a form that has been signed within 1 year of the date of submission. So if the form was submitted today, 12/16/2021, we would need it to be dated more recently than 12/16 of 2020. So within 1 year. All right, so now I'm going to get into some common W-9 obstacles. These are just, when working with W-9s, some of the things that it seems like cause the most confusion, the things that I received the most questions about. Really, one of the big ones is the tin match. Now, just to explain what the tin match is before any information can be updated into Edison, and that's, changing a supplier name or creating a new supplier file through one of the portals. We've got a new supplier, they're registering for the state. they must first pass what is called the IRS 10 match. In the 10 match process, the supplier name from line 1 of the W-9, as well as the tax ID number, are submitted to the IRS as a combination. The IRS will then send us back the results as either a pass or a fail, right? So the name and tax ID number combination either matches IRS records or it does not match IRS records. If it does not match IRS records, we will not be able to process that request. The supplier will need to provide either a different name on line 1, a different tax ID number, or both. It's just that the name on line 1 did not match IRS records for the tax ID number on the W-9. Since those two don't match via the IRS, we can't make that update. We can only create a new supplier file or update an existing supplier file if the supplier name on line 1 of the W-9 matches the tax ID number in part 2 of the W-9, either the social security number or the EIN. Now, this is a message that I know a lot of you have received either through your supplier maintenance email requests to update an existing supplier file, maybe change a supplier name. This is also a very common response from the internal or external supplier registrations, right? So if you submitted a W-9 to supplier maintenance and you received this message here, it says supplier name and tax ID combination does not match IRS records. Now this causes a lot of confusion. We get a ton of people sending in questions. They'll say, well, you said this EIN isn't correct for this name. Well, can you please let them know what EIN is correct for their name? No, we can't do that, right? So the 10 match process, we submit the information supplied to us from the supplier to the IRS. We can only submit to the IRS the information that is given to us, right? So we submit to them line 1 and the tax ID number. They will give it back to us and say, yes, this matches our records, or no, this does not match our records. If it does not match their records, we will need the supplier to submit a new W-9 that's filled out in a different way. Now, one thing, question I always get, people say, can you tell me the correct name? No, I can't, right? They'll also say, can you reach out to the supplier and tell them what they need to do because I don't understand this? Well, anytime, they submitted a name and tax ID number combination that does not match IRS records, supplier maintenance will tell them if it's a social security number, please refer to your social security card. If it's an EIN, please refer to the EIN letter issued to you at the time that you were given the EIN from the IRS. So, right. If there is a new name and tax ID combination that does not pass the 10 match, you'll need to either check your social security number or this EIN letter, right? Now, the EIN letter does cause some issues with sole proprietors, right? I know probably a ton of you watching this have had this scenario happen, right? Where you've got a sole proprietor, they've got their individual name on line 1, their business name on line 2, and they're using their EIN as their tax ID number, right? So you submit all that, it's all good, it's filled out according to the IRS W-9 instructions, but then you get the message back from supplier maintenance, supplier name and tax ID combination does not match IRS records, right? So for the EIN, we would say, please refer to the EIN letter that was issued to you from the IRS when you were given the EIN. Now, sometimes they'll come back and it'll say right up here, the business name. It'll have the business name and the individual's name listed there. The EIN will be listed right over here. So, right, you'll say, this says it has their individual name listed. It has the EIN listed. This is a letter from the IRS, saying individual names on there, EINs on there. This should match. Well, with this EIN letter, if it's got both the business name and the individual name listed right up here, whichever name is listed on top, that is going to be the name that matches IRS records for the EIN, right? So if it's got the business name listed first, the individual's name listed second, and this individual keeps trying to submit the W-9 with their individual name on line 1 for the EIN, it keeps saying supplier name and tax ID combination does not match IRS records. Well, if they want to use this EIN, they're going to need to switch to that business name, right? Another option they would have is to use their social security number instead, right? So when we've got that situation, that's kind of the two options that I give them is either you're going to have to either switch to your business name on line 1. Now that may affect what tax classification you have selected on line 3, or you can keep individual, sole proprietor, single member LLC, and just use your social security number instead of the EIN. But if a name and tax ID number combination is not matching IRS records, please do not keep submitting it that way. You know, it's going to need to go through some sort of change before it can get to a place where we can accept it. So another very common question that we get regarding the W-9s is this situation right here, where line 3 of the W-9 has the box for individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC selected on line 3. Now, down there at the very bottom of this slide, I've got written, this tax classification requires an individual's name, not a business name, to be listed on line 1, right? This is a very common error we get. If this box is selected on line 3, then line 1 should have an individual name. Optionally, line 2 can have your business name, your disregarded entity name, or your DBA doing business as name. But if the box for individual, sole proprietor, single member LLC is selected on line 3, line 1 has to have an individual's name. This is something that I really think I've explained to at least one person every day I've worked this job. It's very common. You know, it's easy to misunderstand, right? People say, I'm a single member LLC. That's why I've got my LLC name listed on line 1. Well, if you're a single member LLC, it should be your individual's name listed on line 1, your LLC name listed on line 2. And where am I getting that? That's coming straight from the W-9 instructions, right? The Form W-9's got about 5 or 6 pages of instructions after. These are instructions for line 1, right? This is line 1 for if line 3 has individual or sole proprietor, single member LLC. So, right, you can see individual. For line 1, if your tax classification on line 3 is individual, generally enter the name shown on your tax return. Sole proprietor or single member LLC, right? This is instructions for line 1. Enter your individual name as shown on your 1040, 1040A, 1040EZ on line 1. You may enter your business, trade, or doing business as DBA name on line 2. So that's right there in the W-9 instructions. Another place where this is really easily laid out is what I was referencing earlier, the Supplier Maintenance IRS W-9 instructional table, right? So over here on the far left, when one of the following tax classifications is selected on line 3, right? Individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC selected on line 3, this is going to tell us exactly what needs to be listed on line 1, right? For an individual, you know, this comes straight from the W-9 instructions I was just reading. Enter the name shown on your tax return. Sole proprietor or single member LLC, enter your individual name as shown on your 1040, 1040A, 1040EZ. Over here, line 2, if you have a business name, trade name, DBA name, or disregarded entity, LLC, enter it on line 2. And, you know, so on and so forth. It'll give you the directions for the rest of the lines as well. All right, so those were kind of the two biggest errors we see. Now I'm going to get into a little bit more of the specific instructions on how to fill out a W-9 based on the tax classification selected on line 3. And in order to do that, I'm going to go through a little bit of an example scenario. I'm going to do a little bit of role playing here. So the state of Tennessee has hired George Costanza and his business, Vandelay Architecture LLC, to design a new building for the state. So George Costanza, he's an individual, right? He's got a small business, Vandelay Architecture LLC, and we have hired him to construct a new building. So for this, I'm going to do a little role playing. I'm going to play the role of the agency representative who's tasked with retrieving a W-9 form from Mr. Costanza and his company, Vandelay Architecture LLC, in order to register them as a new supplier. So I'm going to go through just a couple of different ways George might fill out his W-9 and submit it to me. And then I'm going to go through me as the agency person receiving the W-9. If I should accept this, go ahead and send it to supplier maintenance to be processed. Or if I need to send this back to George, have some corrections made on that. I know it's Vandelay Industries, but I did want to do an LLC. It just makes my example work a little bit better. So if there are any Seinfeld super fans out here, I know my trivia. I'm just trying to make it fit my example. All right, so this is going to be our first one received from George, right? He's going to say, I'm an individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC, right? On line 3, he's got individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC selected. Correct. Now, remember earlier what I said. If the box for individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC is selected, an individual's name has to be listed on line 1. Here, he's got his business name, Vandelay Architecture LLC, listed on line 1. That's going to be incorrect, right? So this one, I would need to send this back to George, request a new W-9 before I submit this one to supplier maintenance. Now, this is one of the most common errors we see in new W-9s that we receive. Please always check to see if that individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC box is selected on line 3. Please make sure an individual's name is listed on line 1, and then you can go ahead, send it back to the supplier, have them be working on a new W-9. That's just going to cut the turnaround time for these requests. All right, so we send this one back to George, say, get us a new W-9. He sends us this, right? He's still saying he's an individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC, but this time he's got his individual name listed on line 1. Additionally, he's got his business name here listed on line 2, which is optional. But since he's a single member LLC, he's got it listed down there. How did he know that? I went ahead and sent him this flowchart, right? And he looked on here. He said, well, this is my federal tax classification. So then this is going to tell me what name needs to be entered on line 1. And he can go over here and say, okay, on line 2, I can enter my business name. All right, so next up, I'm going to go through an example for a corporation business type, right? We've got C Corp and S Corp. This one, we did go back to Vandelay Industries for you trivia sticklers out there. This one is accurate. So for this one, he's saying he's a C corporation on line 3 of the W-9. Well, on line 3 of the W-9, it says check the appropriate federal tax classification of the person or entity whose name is entered on line 1 of the W-9. So for this, we're saying that C corporation is the federal tax classification of the person or entity whose name is entered on line 1. That doesn't make sense, right? George Costanza is an individual's name, not the name of a corporation. Someone could just name a corporation a name, George Costanza, right? It's not likely. They would probably call it George Costanza Inc., LLC, something like that. So this one, if the box for corporation is selected on line 3 of the W-9, we do need the corporation's name to be listed on line 1 of the W-9. If an individual's name is listed on line 1 of the W-9, the only box that should be selected is individual, sole proprietor, single member LLC. It doesn't make sense for the corporation business type, right? And so for that one, I'm going to send George this. I'm going to say, look, if you're a C corporation on line 3, line 1, enter the entity's name as shown on the entity's tax return, right? Not your personal tax return. Line 2, you can enter a DBA, trade, disregarded entity name if applicable. All right, so I sent him that. He's going to send me back this one. He's got C Corporation selected on line 3. Business name, Vandelay Industries on line 1. This is filled out in accordance to the W-9 instructions. So for this one, I would say thank you. I will be submitting this to supplier maintenance now. Next up, we're going to get into limited liability company, LLC. All right, so for this one, we've changed up the business name just a little bit to fit the example, right? This is back to Vandelay Architecture, LLC. So line 1 of this W-9 has a business name, and this business name ends in LLC. Now remember what I said previously. On line 3, the instructions say check the appropriate box for federal tax classification of the person or entity whose name is listed in line 1. If the entity listed on line 1 is a business whose name ends in LLC, that right there is telling us this is a limited liability company, right? So if they include that LLC in their business name on line 1, they need to have this box selected here, right? Check the box for the federal tax classification of the person or entity on line 1. Well, LLC, that's telling us it's going to be this. Anytime this LLC box is selected on line 3, it has to contain either the C, S, or P in this blank spot right here. So for this one, business name on line 1 has LLC. He's got partnership selected. That's going to be incorrect. Like I previously mentioned, since this has LLC in the company name right here, that's going to say this is a limited liability company, and that's going to tell us that this is the box that needs to be selected on line 3. All right, so we're going to send this one back to him, and then George is going to send us a new W-9, right? This one, Vandelay Architecture LLC. We've got the LLC name right here. He's got limited liability company selected on line 3. That's correct. And then also over here, he's got the appropriate C, S, or P entered in the blank space. If the box for limited liability company is selected on line 3, this has to have one of those 3 letters listed here. Just one aside real quick. If we do get a W-9 like this, it's got the box for partnership selected here, but they also wrote in a P right here. We would have to consider that as having more than one box selected on line 3, even if this box is not selected. So if the limited liability company box is not selected on line 3, make sure nothing is entered in this blank space, or we will have to consider that as having more than one box checked on line 3, which the instructions say right here, check only one of the following 7 boxes. All right. So yeah, this is the one he submitted correctly for the LLC. How did he know that? Well, I sent him this, right? I said, if one of these boxes is selected on line 3 of the W-9 limited liability company, line 1 should have the entity's name as shown on the entity's tax return. Line 2, DBA name if applicable. This time he didn't put one. The limited liability company does have additional line 3 requirements. Like I just said, enter the tax classification C, S, or P in the blank space, C corporation, S corporation, or partnership limited liability company. If that's left blank, we will need to return that W-9 for a new one. All right, now let's get into tax exempt / government entities. In addition to his company, Vandelay Industries, LLC, George also wanted to register his tax-exempt charity, the Human Fund, as a supplier with the state of Tennessee. It is Festivus season, so George said, I want to go ahead and, make sure I'm a supplier before I start doing all this business at the end of the year here. So what we will need from George to register his tax-exempt charity, he'll need a new Form W-9, right? He'll need a different one from the Vandelay Industries one because this one is going to have a different federal tax identification number. Tax exempt / government entities for suppliers that are tax exempt or a government entity, the other box should be selected on line 3 of the W-9. So right here at the bottom of the slide, right, this is line 3. We've got other down here, and there's a blank spot here. This tax classification requires a comment to the right of the arrow. So if a supplier has the box for other checked on line 3 of the W-9, they will need to include a comment right down here where that big empty space is highlighted, right? What does that comment need to say? It will need to say either tax exempt, government entity, if applicable, or it will need to list the specific tax code that makes the entity tax exempt. Most commonly, that's going to be 501c3. So if a supplier is tax exempt as their federal tax classification, they'll select this other, and they will need to provide one of those comments in this field here. What we cannot accept as a federal tax classification is if it just says nonprofit, right? We can't accept that because an entity could technically be nonprofit without being tax exempt. So if he submitted this W-9, he's got the human fund on line 1, other box selected, and it just says nonprofit, nothing else, we're going to need to return that and have to ask him for a little bit more specific of a tax classification on line 3. So we're going to return that one, and he comes back with this, and he said, instead of nonprofit, tax exempt. That is okay, as long as it says either tax exempt or the specific tax code. Like I said, it's most commonly 501c3, or if it's a government entity, it could say government entity, but it cannot only say nonprofit. It can include nonprofit, right? If it says tax exempt nonprofit, we can still accept that because it does say tax exempt. If it says nonprofit 501c3, we can accept it because it still says 501c3. If it just says nonprofit, or sometimes for churches, we'll get, they'll say like nonprofit religious or something like that. That we cannot accept. We do need them just to be a little bit more specific, either say tax exempt, your tax code 501c3. Um, and I think that's all I've got at this time. We'll go ahead and open up the floor for any questions. I didn't see if anyone had been typing any questions at all this whole time, but yeah, if anyone's got any questions, now's your time.
Great job, Ryan. You did amazing.
Thank you, Caitlin.
That was really good.
All right, looks like we got a question here. Let's see. Can a person who is an individual, sole proprietor, or single member LLC have both a social security number and an EIN? Can a person technically have two supplier ID numbers based on their tax identification number? So, Nick, that is a good question. A person can have both a social security number and an EIN, right? But they just cannot submit a W-9 that contains both on the same form. Your second question is also a good question, right? Can a supplier technically have two different supplier IDs based on their tax IDs? Yes, technically they can, right? So if a person has a social security number and an EIN, they technically can have an existing supplier file set up for each of those. Like I was kind of going into, each supplier file can only have one tax ID number. Each tax ID number can only have one supplier file. So as long as they're different tax ID numbers, one person can theoretically have multiple supplier files out there. Let's see. Natasha says, if we are having issues with our submission and need a little extra help after the job aids, who can we contact directly? Natasha, I will say if you're working on an internal supplier registration, a new supplier registration, please email the supplier maintenance email address. That's supplier.maintenance@tn.gov, and include in the subject line ISRQ. That stands for Internal Supplier Registration Question. So if you're going through a new registration and you're having issues, it keeps getting sent back, you don't know what's wrong, send an email to supplier.maintenance@tn.gov. In the subject line, include ISRQ, that stands for Internal Supplier Registration Question. That will automatically sort your question to me, who oversees the internal and external supplier registrations. I'll pull it up, let you know exactly what's wrong. If it's not relating to a new supplier registration, yeah, Caitlin, we've got a volunteer. So yeah, you can email Caitlin Huckabee, caitlin.huckabee@tn.gov. Latasha Gooch says, can we have a copy of this PowerPoint for reference? That's one thing I forgot to mention when I was going through the accounting job aids website. At the very bottom of the supplier maintenance section, we've got a section for these agency workshops. You can go back in there and we've got the full recording of the supplier update form workshop done by Christy. You can pull that up, just, you can watch it all again. In addition to it being there with all of our instructions, forms, everything like that. So this will be posted to the accounting job aids website afterwards as a complete movie, I guess. Mandy says, if they have a single member LLC and their name on line 1, does that mean that it is always the SSN you need? First of all, hi, Mandy. Nice to hear from you again. Always good to talk to Mandy. So no, to answer your question, right? You can have the single member LLC box selected on line 3 with an EIN, right? But the EIN does have to pass the TIN match for the individual's name listed on line 1. And that's where we do sometimes run into some trouble if the person's name is not TIN matching for the EIN. That's where we have to pivot and say, okay, you may need to list your business name on line 1, have a different tax classification on line 3, or, you always have the option of just using your social security number instead. I hope that answers your question, Mandy. Connie Truitt. Hi, Connie. Nice to hear from you as well. Both TDOT representatives, I believe. What if the USPS has 2 spellings for a city such as Mount Juliet, Mount Pleasant? Which one do we use? So there are a few city names that have to be entered into Edison in a specific way. Mount Juliet is one of them. For Mount Juliet specifically in Edison, we do need it to be spelled out. We do need that Mount, M-O-U-N-T space Juliet. We can't have MT Juliet entered into Edison. Mount Pleasant, that one's not on our list. I'm not quite sure about that one, but I would assume go ahead and put, the full Mount, M-O-U-N-T for Mount Pleasant as well. With those, if you ever have a question on those, you can send it into that ISRQ subject line to the supplier maintenance email address, and I can get back to you on that. But yeah, there are a few city names. Mount Juliet's one of them that just have to be entered in a certain way into Edison. Let's see, Mary B. Kenton. We get a lot of pushback from suppliers on handwritten signatures due to the pandemic. Is this an IRS requirement or just an internal requirement? And if so, the rationale behind it. Let's see, Caitlin, do you want to field that one?
Okay. From
Mary B. Kenton.
okay, sorry, I was
Oh,
typing
no,
in the
you're okay.
chat. Okay, let me look at that. So we do request that the W-9 be hand signed. If you are having a lot of trouble with suppliers not able to do this, please reach out to me and I will see if we can come up with something else. But yeah, we do ask that they be hand signed. A lot of them want to use the electronic signatures, and unfortunately, that's just not very secure. Anyone can easily type out someone's name or copy and paste someone's signature to the document. So that's why we do not accept electronic signatures. We have in the past accepted some digital, but there are some circumstances around that have to be followed. So that's why I ask if you just cannot get one, if you cannot get a supplier to hand sign a W-9, please just contact me and I'll see what we can do.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Next up, Mandy says the USPS Lookup link Ryan sent me has been a godsend. Yes, Caitlin linked that actually right below the tools.usps.com. Anyone who submits internal supplier registrations, I would definitely suggest bookmarking that with those and with the supplier update form, right? If you're submitting a new address to supplier maintenance, on the supplier update form or in one of the portals, in the internal supplier registration portal, we do require the address to be entered per USPS standards. And that means that, the street suffix is going to be abbreviated street to ST, drive to drive, that kind of thing. If you're submitting, a request to change an address on a supplier update form, a request for a new address in the registration, I would recommend always just typing in the address into that USPS lookup. It'll give it to you in exact USPS standards and abbreviations. So thank you for that, Mandy. Peggy, she says we aren't required to submit a W-9 when we add a location such as a CAT G. However, we have to fill out the SSN or the EIN on the form. Is there a way around this, since we'd probably have to get the W-9 from them anyway to fill in that information? So in order to update a supplier file in Edison, the supplier update form does have to be submitted, and the supplier update form does require that the supplier's tax ID number be listed up at the top. That is just for verification, that we're both referring to the same supplier file, that all the needed information from the supplier has been received. Yeah, so Peggy, like you said, you do not necessarily need a new W-9 in order to add a location to a supplier file, but in order to request the new location, you probably do need the tax ID number to be able to fill it out in the supplier update form. Currently, for those, we do require you to get the tax ID number from the supplier in order to make that change to their supplier file. Let's see, Donna Keith, has supplier maintenance considered to format or code both the update form and internal registration to populate all capital letters? That is not something I have thought of. It is a good idea, that is something that things occasionally will get sent back for. But yeah, that's just one thing, please keep that in mind on the supplier update form and in the registrations. New information, please just be sure and enter that into all caps. That is a good suggestion, Donna. Maybe we will look further into that. Heather, let's see, what constitutes an emergency when requesting same-day entry / approval? I think maybe even on the emergency request procedures, it might say. Or Caitlin, do you have a quick answer for that? Let's see.
Yeah, this may sound extreme, but loss of life, of a large amount of money, like large fees. I'm trying to, it
Or I
just,
think we've said, like, if someone's going to lose their job if this doesn't go through
lose
today or
job,
something
things
like that.
like electricity, like something very substantial is going to happen if we do not get the request processed that same day. I will say I'm so proud of our team. We have kept the turnaround times really low. If you've been a part of the state government for a while, you will know. You can probably think back to the days of our 10-day turnarounds or 15-day turnaround, and we have kept it, under 3 days in the new supplier registration and our supplier maintenance email. Very proud of our team, and we're even on 1 to 2 day turnarounds right now. So, if you can wait those couple of days, please, please, please just wait. If not, submit it through the emergency request, but we will have to, make a business decision to say, does your justification constitute an emergency? Just because of, a voucher may have been denied, or, it's been sitting around for 30 days and it has to get paid now, may not constitute an emergency. But yeah, loss of life, disconnection of services, things like that constitutes an emergency.
Yeah, and with those emergency request procedures, it does require you to at least, list out why this is an emergency or some justification. So thank you, Caitlin.
Yes, and I will say, be careful, everyone. We have gotten, because we are so, our turnaround times are so low, we have noticed when emergencies come in, they've already been submitted through, the supplier maintenance email or the new supplier registrations. And so we're kind of duplicating work at that point. So just please be mindful of that.
All right, Nick says when submitting entities/names with tax ID numbers to the IRS for pass-fail, is there any room for error with regards to the punctuation, such as XYZ Inc. versus XYZ Inc. without the period, commas, or does it have to be 100% accurate based on their EIN letter or SS card? Nick, this is another great question. Nick's killing it with these questions, y'all. This is good. So yes and no, right? So the punctuation, we cannot enter periods or commas into Edison. So in new supplier registrations, right, you can't enter the period or the comma. If someone's got Inc. dot, INC dot, we'll do that without the dot. Now that will not affect tin match status, right? Tin match isn't going to fail if the dot is not included after the INC. Same thing with XYZ, comma, LLC, right? Sometimes they'll have company name, comma, LLC. Well, you won't be able to enter that comma into the registration. So you'll just say XYZ, LLC with a space, no comma. That will not affect the tin match status. Now, one thing I will say is dashes in names, straight line dash, right? So someone's got a dual last name. That does need to be included if someone, that'll make the name one combined name of two names instead of, name space name. That can affect the tin match status. So dashes in names, please include those, but commas, periods, those will not affect the tin match. Donna Keith, in the new supplier registration in Edison Step 5, has supplier maintenance the ability to disable beans it causes an error? Let's see. In the new registration in Edison Step 5, has supplier maintenance the ability to disable beans it causes an error and requests a reason code? So Donna, I think this was one we were emailing about the other day. In step 5 of the ISR, it's going to ask for a reason code. The reason code is not needed. Now, Donna had one where right after the reason code, there's a space for comments. She was entering a comment there, so it was saying, if you have a comment here, you need to have a reason code. Just leave that comments blank, leave the reason code blank. Comments for an internal supplier registration should be submitted on the identifying information tab of the registration. So that's going to be tab 2 instead of tab 5. That tab 5 comments is what was causing an error with the reasons code on that one. Let's see, Mandy, I have started asking for the EIN and not necessarily submitting the W-9 for issues that need the number but not the W-9, just to keep it from being rejected if it's not filled out correctly. So I've started asking for the EIN. Okay, W-9 for issues that need the number. Okay, yeah, so she's saying, I think she was referring to that one asked earlier by Peggy. So like instead of asking for a new W-9, you can just ask the supplier for their tax ID number when requesting to add a new location to the supplier file. Janice Moore, this training has been really great. Thanks for much putting this together. You're welcome. Thank you, Janice. Let's see. Donna, supplier maintenance advised to use the name in Edison to complete the update form. Which tab in Edison? What if the name is too long? Example, okay. So I will go ahead and pull this one up. So the supplier name is going to be line 1 of the W-9, and that's going to be, you know what, I'll just pull up this specific one for you real quick, Donna. One moment, please. Uh, All right, gotta log back in. Okay, but she's asking, I think, on the supplier update form where it says supplier name, what name is that referring to? That's going to be the main supplier name on the supplier file. Right there on the identifying information tab, it's going to say supplier name. That is not going to be the DBA name, doing business as name from line 2 of the W-9 or on the supplier file. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so this is the one you were asking about, Donna. Supplier file 155, is that right? 692, Tanya Ketron. This is the supplier name right up here in the top right corner. Supplier name, Tanya
Hey,
Ketron. That's what you're going to use on the supplier update form.
hey Ryan.
Yes.
It's 115692
Oh, okay.
for the
115.
long name.
Okay. I was thinking that seemed short. There we go. Thank you, Lee. All right, so this one does have a long name, right? And it just cuts off right here. You'll do just the exact same thing on the supplier update form. Just type that name till you can't type anymore, right? It'll cut off at a certain point. That's okay. Let's see. So Donna says the supplier update form, the most recent one, the revised 821, section 7, added synchronizations. Is it possible to add an explanation to the form and update SM instructed manual? Yes, synchronizations. Caitlin, do you want to take this one? I'm not really.
Yeah, no, you're right. So, this synchronizations, I mean, if you don't know what that is, then it does not pertain to you. Synchronizations is some agencies, some subsystems need to have synchronization set up in Edison so that the supplier's address information is synchronized to their subsystem. So if you don't know what that means, then that means that you probably do not have a subsystem in your agency that utilizes these synchronizations. But we can add some information to that, or possibly on the supplier update form, helpful hints, so that it can help agencies understand that.
Thank you, Caitlin. Victoria says if a supplier needs to add or emit address and the invoice does not have the street suffix on it, would a blank business check with the address on it be an acceptable proof of address, or would it just be an invoice with the correct address or a business letterhead with the address? So yes, Victoria, in order to add a remittance address to a supplier file, we do require either an invoice to or from the supplier or a hand-signed memo on company letterhead. So we would not be able to accept the check as remittance address documentation. As far as if you got like an invoice, like my example earlier with 102 Main Street, if it just said 102 Main, I would assume we would need to send that back and have them provide additional documentation with the complete address provided. Do you agree with that, Caitlin?
Yes, I was trying to pull up our address standards
Mm-hmm.
on the website, that I make sure and I say this. Let me see. Okay. Thing. We pretty much just need, we don't want to ask the supplier to, of course, change their invoice or anything like that. But if you can provide additional documentation to support the street suffix that you're asking for on the supplier update form, that will help. But yeah, but we don't need to ask them to change their invoice. Of course, if they're typing up a memo, it should have the street suffix. Um, so yeah, so our instructions state here, this is the, let me put this into the chat here. Just that we need additional supporting documentation to support the address suffix.
All right. Thanks, Caitlin. Donna Keith says how to add the remit to dual pay. So yeah, if you're needing to add a remittance address, I know Donna works with the dual payments. That will require a supplier update form. You'll need to request add remittance address, and then you'll just use, the same supporting documentation as usual for those dual pays. I know they're a little bit different than the usual supplier maintenance email requests, but yeah, you will just need to have a supplier update form with a request to add a remittance address.
We are over time, but I will give us 5 more minutes because it seems like you all have really great questions, and I hate to cut us off too short. So we'll just do 5 more minutes.
Hey, Caitlin, I've got a question.
Hey, Brandy.
I called and left you a voicemail about an AT&T invoice. I've reached out to AT&T. I cannot get them to give me their tax ID number. Do I have to have it just to add a remittance address? They've already got 46 addresses listed, and it's just a new PO box at the same like post office station, but it's just a different PO box number.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we will have to have that tax ID because it just helps us to know that, yes, we're, this address that we need added to this supplier file does belong to this supplier. Because AT&T, if I'm not mistaken, I think they have a couple of different supplier files out there. And so it's just important for us to make sure that if we're adding an address, that we're adding it to the correct supplier file with the correct tax ID. Do you all have a contact there, or does someone in your agency have a contact? I don't mind trying to help you, contact them as well.
I have reached out to them. I have called, left a voicemail. I have emailed. I can't get anybody to email me back. The invoice is due on the 20th, and apparently this is going to be their new address for this. We have 2 AT&Ts. We pay AT&T, and then we pay AT&T Mobility. The AT&T Mobility invoices that we get has their tax ID number on it, and that's no problem. But the regular AT&T bills that we get from them do not have it on there. I called. I was on the phone for the better part of 2 hours just trying to get in touch with somebody, and I can't. And if we don't get this bill paid, we're going to get docked.
Yes, send me a copy of that invoice and let me see if I can figure something out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I understand to everyone that it is a pain getting that tax ID to ensure that we're getting the addresses on the correct supplier file, but it is, super important that we make sure that we have accurate supplier files, that we are, making payments under the correct supplier file, because our office is also responsible for issuing the 1099 forms. So that's why it's just super important that we set all this up correctly and that payments are being paid correctly under the correct tax ID.
Connie says, if the supplier puts a remit on line 2, but it is not their DBA, do we need to ask for a new W-9? So do you mean that they put a remit address on line 2 of the W-9? If so, we would need to request a new W-9 from them. Line 2 of the W-9 should either have, a DBA name, disregarded entity, business name, something like that, or it can just be left blank. I'm not sure if you mean a remit address listed on line 2, but if that's the case, then we would need a new W-9.
Can you hear me, Ryan?
Yes, I can now.
Okay, no, what they've done, they put the company name on line 1,
Mm-hmm.
and then they put the name that's going to be on their invoice. They're asking for a new remit address to be added, but they're not changing their DBA. It's just, they probably shouldn't have put it on there, I don't think, because they're not changing their alternate name. So
they're adding a new address with a new DBA name. Is that true?
well, they're just adding another remit address to that main company. Because, like, say, for instance, the AutoZone, they might have AutoZone Inc., and under that, they're going to have AutoZone store number 288. Well, that's not going to be a DBA. It's just going to be a new remit location.
So Connie, to add a new address, we do not have to have the W-9 form. We just need the invoice or a signed memo on company letterhead.
Well,
So
I
if you
think
have,
I think they were requesting something else as well, though. So,
oh, like a change of name, tax classification, or a new 1099 address, is that?
yeah, I can't remember now which it was because I've looked at so many in the last 24 hours, but it was something that was going to require a W-9 as well. So,
Why don't you send it to Ryan and I and let us look at it and see what we need, okay? Does
okay,
that sound good?
yeah, the company's name is like Distributors Holding, and then on their line 2, they put Union Auto Parts store number 208. But it's,
Where'd you go?
I don't know. I'll try to find it and send it because now I'm confused myself.
Okay,
All right.
yeah, send it to us.
We got a good question from Brenda here. If the W-9 has an individual's first and last name on line 1, the business name listed on line 2, and they have checked individual, sole proprietor, single member LLC box in line 3, what will accounts payable check name be paid to? The individual's name on line 1 or the company name on line 2? So within Edison, the DBA name, the company name on line 2 is called the payment alternate name, and that is the name that checks made out to that address will be paid to. So if you're, creating a new supplier file with a W-9, you've got supplier name on line 1, DBA name on line 2, and that's the only address that's on file for them. Any payments made to that address, the check will be made out to the payment alternate name, which is the name from line 2 of the W-9.
All right, everyone. I think I will have to cut us off at this time. I'm so sorry to do that. This has been super fun, but I'll have to end it now. But please, like I said at the very beginning, if you have any great topic ideas for us for the next training, please send it to us at the supplier maintenance email address. In the subject line, put ATW so that your email is routed to the correct place. So yeah, if you have any great topic ideas for us, anything that you want us to cover, please send that to us. And if you have any questions as well, please send it via that channel. But thank you all so much. Thank you to Ryan. He did an amazing job. He always does great. So thank you, Ryan. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah. Oh, sorry.